Welcome to Bournebrook Magazine's podcast. This week, Bournebrook columnist Guy Denton talks to Bill Kristol, a well-known and respected American political commentator who's now also the editor-at-large at thebulwark.com. Guy begins by asking Mr. Kristol about his early political development.
I can't resist beginning by asking about your background, as being raised by two of the most consequential public intellectuals in modern American history must have been quite the experience. How did your parents influence your intellectual development?
Well, I give them a lot of credit for not over-intellectualizing everything when I was a kid, and I spent an awful lot of time playing sports and watching schlock TV shows and the like. So I had I grew up in Manhattan, so that was a little different from perhaps Americans who grew up in rural areas or in the middle of the country, but I had a pretty normal childhood, to be honest. And I think they always thought that was important. And they really wanted me to go my own way intellectually. And I ended up following to some degree in their footsteps, but I went off to college and studied political philosophy, and I went on and got a PhD in that and taught for a few years. So they tried not to be too heavy-handed, I would say, in shaping my views, though I'm sure they had a huge effect.
Did you ever rebel against their views and feel perhaps drawn toward leftism even at any point while you were growing up?
Yes, they of course had been when they were young, so it wasn't, maybe that itself wouldn't have been even a rebellion, but yeah, in various ways. I'd say more maybe the opposite when they were Cold War liberals in the 60s. They were always complicated in their liberalism, so it's not quite correct, the caricature that they just, they were all liberals and then one day they became conservatives. My mother had written appreciatively of Lord Acton and Burke and others who were not in the American liberal pantheon exactly in the 50s, and Disraeli and so forth. And my father had always been critical of certain strains of American and Western liberalism. So, but having said so, I probably in a way rebelled a little to the right when I was young. I read Bill Buckley, and like a lot of people my age, conservatism was challenging a kind of stale liberal orthodoxy, and so I was even more open to some of the real conservatives, perhaps, than my parents, who I think correctly saw that, they're interesting thinkers and interesting writers, obviously, on the more reactionary side, and some great poets and novelists and so forth. But they thought that was not a sound basis really for politics, and I think they were right. But I would say my taste, when I was in high school and college, was a little bit to the kind of slight, Tory/reactionary right in terms of literature and essayists and so forth. But I was always interested in the American founding, and I wrote in Tocqueville and sort of how to defend liberal democracy. So in that respect, I was always pretty much on the center. I've always enjoyed reading, always tried over the years, and I always advise other people, young people, to do this if possible, to read stuff on left and right. Including pretty radical things. Often the more radical thinkers are the more interesting ones. I don't think sometimes they're not very sound guides, but it would be foolish not to read an intelligent Marxist account of modern history or a reactionary critique of modern society. And I've always found those, when I taught for a few years, I always tried to teach those kinds of works as well as, let's call it, the more mainstream works. You have to answer those criticisms, obviously.
Speaking of college, and speaking of radicalism in some ways, given how colleges are today, but you taught political philosophy at Penn and Harvard before you entered the realms of government and media. And just in broad terms, can you offer any reflections on your experiences at those institutions, and what benefits have those experiences afforded you subsequently?
Yeah, I've never regretted getting a PhD and spending a few years having that kind of leisure and poverty, but still leisure, and reading books, learning a couple of languages, not very well, but still a little bit, so I could, look at things in the original later on and so forth, and doing non-practical things, whether it was, reading Platonic dialogues or 18th century political thought. And so, and then I taught that. I also taught a little American political thought. I taught a couple of novels in that class. I remember Penn. then I ended up at Harvard at the Kennedy School with a very different teaching sort of obligation to try to figure out how to teach. The Kennedy School is a graduate school in public policy, so that was more teaching people who were going into government, not economics, which they were being taught fine without me, and not public management and so forth, which they were being taught fine without me, but a little bit more the founding and sort of the role of institutions and principles and in politics, so the Federalist and that sort of thing. And so I very much enjoyed all those years. My experiences were, as always, there were some colleagues I liked and some that weren't so great. Penn's department was messed up when I was there, but I left, so that was okay. The Kennedy School wasn't quite my cup of tea ultimately, and it's just a different kind of school than what I'm fundamentally interested in. But I do feel that I learned a lot, and when young people ask for advice, I tend not to give. My main advice is always to don't overthink things and do what you want to do, because you never know how things are going to turn out. But looking back, I'm glad I spent, I guess it would be almost my 20s and early 30s. Doing that rather than coming right to Washington and getting in the hurly-burly. I mean, maybe that would have been fine too, and maybe I would have learned other things that I never learned. I never worked on the Hill in Congress, for example, so that's a little bit of a gap in my Washington experience. But I think having some perspective and some distance on the fights of the day, a little bit of history. Well, and you can get that in a lot of ways. My own background is very much political philosophy, but studying history, reading literature, classics, science. I mean, many of the most interesting and I think effective people I've met in Washington are people who didn't come here at age 22 and get right into the day-to-day crafting of legislation or fighting campaigns. A lot of good friends did do that, incidentally, and some of them are terrific and very thoughtful about it. But I think there's something to be said for taking a little more time to get to study things in a deeper way and get a little more perspective, perhaps, on what's happening right now.
How would you describe your political views today? Given what is happening right now, have any fundamental changes occurred in your worldview in recent years?
It's a good question in the sense that it's a question I've been thinking a lot about. I got asked that I remember about 5, 6, 7 years ago, so maybe 10 years ago. I can't remember where I was on a campus probably, and someone asked perfectly intelligently this question. I was at the time, 55 probably, and someone said, okay, well, what have you really changed your mind about over the last 30 years? And I got to say at the time, I had a couple of particular things. Society changes a lot, and culture, and be kind of nuts not to change a little bit and rethink things as you see things. But I actually remember saying thinking about in the big sweep of things, hadn't changed my mind that much about fundamental things. I think I wouldn't quite answer that way today. I mean, I think I've really come to in the era of Trump and of rising authoritarian populism on the right, but also a kind of cancel culture on the left, I've come to a much stronger appreciation of liberal democracy. I mean, I always was for liberal democracy, but of how fragile it is, how much it needs to be defended, and of liberalism broadly speaking. And I use the term more in the maybe European sense, but and a little less indulgent, perhaps, of a certain kind of conservatism that doesn't, that indulges too easily a kind of facile critique of liberalism. I'll put it that way. Make it, that there's a kind of, it's very easy to see all the problems with modern individualist, somewhat materialist, atomistic liberal democracy and the culture that goes with it and so forth. I mean, and those are all interesting, legitimate critiques. And I've learned an awful lot from an awful lot of people who've written about that. At the end of the day, though, you've got to sort of say, well, what's the alternative? And isn't it, and how can one strengthen some of the institutions and mores and qualities of liberal democracy from within, so to speak? And I guess I'm much more open to that, and I've become sort of more liberal in a way, therefore, in the last few years, and a little more impatient with some of the, as I say, sort of facile, critiques, which are true as far as they go sometimes, but don't really. They could be critiques of any regime or any form of life. Often, they have a kind of nostalgia for a past that's very unspecified, and it's unclear what was so much better then. And also, I do think, as a practical matter, the underrating of just liberty, freedom as a good, is something that I think I always valued it an awful lot. When I came to Washington really to work for Reagan and foreign policy, especially, it was what motivated me more than anything else. But at home too, the kind of critique of over centralization and excessively big government in the anti-state, I was very much and remain very much on board with that. But I just think Tocqueville says somewhere, I think near the end of Democracy in America, that, how does he put it? In other ages, he would respect freedom, but in this age, he's inclined to revere it, or something like that, because he just, the dangers are so much greater, really, with kind of modern democratic versions of tyranny, and including more subtle versions. I guess I'm in that respect maybe more Tocquevillian than I was 20 years ago.
To that point, you've referred to yourself as a Democrat for 2020. Does that reflect purely your disillusionment with the Republican Party, or does it reflect some more fundamental changes that have occurred in your philosophy or similar?
I'd say mostly the former. That is, I wouldn't hesitate if John McCain were on the ballot or Mitt Romney to support them. So I wouldn't overstate it. But I think I have learned, as anyone would. I mean, in this time of turmoil, there were weaknesses in conservatism. I didn't quite appreciate how deep they went, perhaps, and failures in the American conservative movement. I don't think they disqualify a lot of good things that were done and a lot of very good people who were part of it. But I think it's clear that those weaknesses were a little stronger than some of us thought. And conversely, I've got to say, we're talking here in mid-August during the Democratic convention. Maybe this will all be falsified by whatever happens tomorrow. But, you watch that convention, it's a party that's got a lot of things in it that I don't agree with, and some parts of it that I fear and that I really worry about. But also a party that's trying, I would say, to speak for, the political center, for decency, for constitutional norms. Now, whether they'll follow through, all the pressures on them, that's a big question, of course. But it doesn't, more than I would have expected a few years ago. It's a party that has, in reaction to Trump, and contrary to the predictions of a lot of people on the right, hasn't gone left, really. It's a party that sort of has looked at Trump and said, yikes. And some of the reaction, of course, has been to the left, if you will. And there's too much tolerance of cancel culture. And there's a lot of aspects of the international left that have penetrated the Democratic Party that I don't like. And I could go on about that. But I still feel, I feel more respectful, I guess I would put it this way, of the sort of centrist strain in the Democratic Party, and a little more hopeful that they could prevail, at least for a while, than I probably would have said 5 years ago.
You mentioned some of the flaws in the conservative movement and the Republican Party that enabled Trump to be elected. Could you elaborate on those? What exactly do you think brought the conservative movement to this point?
I mean, a lot of it was, adventitious, and just it happened because, it was a multi-candidate primary, and Jeb Bush, people didn't want to go back to another Bush, and so forth. So one can over-interpret things. The history is very contingent, in my opinion, and therefore, could be that we could be sitting here and Jeb Bush or Marco Rubio or Scott Walker could have been nominated, and they might have well have won. I think they probably would have, and we'd be having a very different conversation, and it wouldn't feel this way. So I think one can overstate some of this. On the other hand, there's a kind of international aspect to the authoritarian populism, which suggests that I don't know what it suggests exactly, maybe that it's always a potential, or maybe that there's something about 21st century capitalism and globalization that makes it fertile ground for those kinds of movements. In the American context, though, I think, I put it this way, I was well aware of distasteful aspects of the Republican Party and the conservative movement. I spent a lot of time fighting them. And we did fight them pretty successfully. That's the irony, it seems to me. Pat Buchanan got quite a lot of votes in 92 and 96, but we all said we can't not only not support him, but we shouldn't really accept him in the party. And he, in fact, got kind of driven out of the party by the end of the 90s and ran obviously as an independent candidate in 2000. I'd say the same about Ron Paul. I'd say the same about various racists who popped up, explicit racists. And so, it wasn't that we, in a huge political party that's getting 50, 60 million votes in presidential elections, there are going to be people you don't like, people not just you don't like, but people who need to be repudiated, and elements of it that are distasteful and dangerous even. And that's true on the right and left. But I think we try. My friend Charlie Sykes says, these were recessive genes in the Republican Party. They were kept pretty recessive, really, for most of the time in most circumstances. You could go through the Republican presidential candidates, the Republican governors in most states, the Republican leaders in the House and the Senate, and I think that's a pretty respectable group over the last 30, 40 years. And most of the main policies, too, I would say. But there was this recessive gene, and as happens with recessive genes, it sort of popped up and through a variety of circumstances became dominant. And then what's really hard, what is most worrisome and most telling as a criticism is not that Donald Trump won the nomination, but that the Republican Party, instead of being a barrier and a guardrail against the worst aspects of Trump and Trumpism, is just almost completely capitulated. And for me, that shows a kind of a weakness that I wouldn't have expected. The possibility of Trump being a nominee, I don't think I would have ruled that out. I didn't rule it out, didn't expect it. The possibility of, individual congressmen and senators being irresponsible and demagogic, absolutely. But the fact that the whole party has rationalized, enabled, not more than tolerated, but really gone along with Trump, and the degree which he's now shaping candidates who are coming forward, and Trumpism is so dominant, and conservative intellectuals and elites also are so willing to go along. For me, that's really been a blow. I mean, not a blow, but it's been a surprise, and unfortunately, one has to be instructed by these surprises, right? So the conservative, it's funny, the base of the party, I'll just go on for another minute, but what they call the base, the mass movement, let's say, that supports Trump, anyone who's studied the history of democracy or the history of politics isn't surprised that there are large parts of the public that are susceptible to demagogic appeals, especially when things are difficult and when there are cultural and social changes are happening quickly and economic changes, and you put it all together. I don't know that anyone really would be that surprised to discover that, yes, there are a lot of people who feel resentful about these changes, are angry, they themselves haven't done well, perhaps legitimately have complaints about some of the economic consequences of globalization and so forth, feel neglected and looked down on by cultural elites. All that's predictable. One job of responsible politicians is to try to channel that in a better direction, but that didn't happen, and Trump was able to exploit it. The elites, though, the conservative intellectuals, journalists, Wall Street Journal editorial page, National Review, donors, major business figures, the fact that they've all been so willing to go along, and when they know better or should know better, and don't have to go along. I mean, they're not living lives of, misery and of deep dissatisfaction, or at least one didn't think they were. They seem to be doing well enough in America. That has been that's been a shock, honestly, and it does say something to me about, I don't know, that is more telling, I think, in terms of making me rethink some aspects of modern American conservatism, which I would have said to you 5 years ago was almost uniquely, but with Britain, I would say, with Thatcher, I mean, a very impressive and admirable version of conservatism that has avoided almost all the traps and the pitfalls of continental style conservatism. But it's a little hard to say that right now with Trump as president, and with the party totally and the conservative movement totally supporting Trump. Trump as president is less indicative of anything, because anything can happen once, right, in an election. But the fact that the conservative movement and the Republican Party are so complicit in Trump and Trumpism, that does say something.
You mentioned President Trump's acolytes, I suppose, within government, who are such as those within the House Freedom Caucus, who are very much embracing populism, very much fashioning themselves after him in their conduct. What is your perspective on them, just generally? But then also, if President Trump is defeated in the election, what will become of them? And likewise, what will become of them if he is successful in the election?
If he's successful, I think we have a full-on Trumpy Republican Party. To use the British analogy would be as if Corbyn had actually won, become prime minister, governed in a Corbynite way for 4 years, and then got reelected. I mean, that would just be the party, and people would have left. A lot of people would have left the party, and there might be a third party, a more successful third party than the Liberal Democrats and so forth. But I mean, there's no question that a victory for Trump, in my opinion, fundamentally changes the character of the Republican Party, and people like me start thinking, well, can we work with it to be a Democrat? Is there a possibility, despite the historic difficulty of third parties. For a third party, maybe there's a grouping that you can be that's not quite a party, that works with decent people in both parties and so forth. So that's if Trump wins. If Trump loses, a lot would depend on the character of the loss and the magnitude, I think. The best case would be to take the British example, since I'm talking to you and you're over there. A friend of mine, your age, from Britain, said, well, could it be like Corbyn in the sense that he's lost, and I don't follow British politics that closely anymore, but my sense is it's sort of impressive how much the Labour Party has moved away from Corbyn, how quickly, and how the new lead. There's not much nostalgia for Corbyn. There's not much paying even homage to those years. It's sort of, okay, we got rid of that, was bad, and now we're in a different place.
Whoops.
You know, now, they haven't quite embraced Tony Blair again, but I mean, they're sort of in a different place. That would be the best case for the Republican Party. But Corbyn wasn't prime minister, and we didn't have 4 years of everyone. There were some votes in Parliament, obviously, where people went along with Corbyn who shouldn't have, perhaps, but it wasn't the same as what's been happening in the US for 3.5 years. And I don't think the same would be true either of the intellectual side of the left in Britain, which was pretty anti-Corbyn. I think a lot of it, at least, for, maybe more accommodating than at times than they should have been, but not really the way the American right has been with Trump. So that makes me somewhat pessimistic about the degree to which it'll be able to, we will be able to move beyond Trump, to liberate ourselves from Trump. I think there has to be some confrontation with what happened. We don't have to have purges. We don't have to have, trials and, that sort of stuff. But and people apologizing. But we do need to. It can't just be that he loses and everyone says, "Well, that was kind of unfortunate, and now let's just move on." For one thing, the Trumpism is so deep now, I think, in the body politic. The demagoguery, the demonizing of opponents, the appeals to barely veiled racial and other sorts of appeals, the kind of just the dumbing down of everything, the populist sloganeering. There needs to be almost repudiation of that. A party that sort of, in which you run in a primary and you just routinely denounce Mitt Romney as being a liberal, and then you denounce John McCain as being, I don't know what. That's not a party I want to be part of, and I don't think it can be a healthy party, honestly. Now, I'm not saying is the opposite going to happen? No, people like me aren't going to be central, and there's not going to be a party that denounces Trump, perhaps, and elevates Romney and McCain, but at least somewhere in between. That would be maybe a better outcome for the country, because you do want to have a reasonable center-right party. But I'm worried. I guess I'm worried that Trump and Trumpism don't go away as quickly as a lot of people hope.
Whatever happens next, how likely is it, do you think, that the two major political parties may soon be on their way out? Is it probable at all, or are we still not there yet?
Possible, maybe not quite probable. There's such, obstacles to so many things that strengthen the two-party system here, more even, I think, than in Britain, that make it, and the parties are so entrenched and they're just big, huge organizations with lots of members and lots of elected officials. And so you look at a Senate that's, I don't know what, 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats, a couple of nominal independents, but they really are parts of the parties. They caucus with them and to get supported by them at election. And if it's 53-47 out of 100, it's a little hard to say, well, gee, those parties are falling apart. I mean, in fact, if anything, there'll be fewer votes this year for independent candidates than there have been in many recent elections, partly the sort of effect of Trump and the rallying of all anti-Trump types to the Democrats. But so on the one hand, you could look at it and say, there are these flare-ups occasionally, but don't bet on third parties. On the other hand, there are other things that have happened in terms of technology and the country and campaign financing, media, that do make it more possible to go around the party structures. The way people have gone around them so far is they've gone around them to get the party nominations, but the parties remain the sort of the credentialing, ultimately the credentialing force. But that could change. I mean, is it conceivable that by 2024 we have a genuinely independent presidential? Let's say Biden governs, does his best, doesn't do great. The left sort of becomes resurgent or insurgent in the Democratic Party, and Biden doesn't run for re-election, and the left nominates someone, and then the right nominates a Trumpy candidate. I do think in that circumstance in 2024, let's say Macron type candidate, just to take an example, it's pretty recent. could that person really put together a race where he or she would have a shot at winning or getting a significant number of electoral votes? I do think so. And the same might happen even at the state level in 2022. So I think it's more likely than I would have said than for most of my adult lifetime that the two-party system is at risk, and in a good way, actually, in a sense. But it remains awfully sticky, in terms of American history and American politics.
Changing topics, mercifully, I dare say, you have been a major figure within the media space since the 1990s. And how has the media, in your perspective and experience, changed over time? And has it ever been quite this rabid?
Yeah. I mean, that we forget how rabid it was at times, or parts of it at times, in the McCarthy era and stuff. So I've always warned against too much nostalgia for the good old days. I think if we went back and actually looked at the media we were being given in 1968, when there were just 3 television networks and very sort of, the TV news shows that were all produced within a mile of each other in Manhattan and very much conformist in all kinds of ways. I think we'd be kind of horrified that that's all we really could watch. There was no cable, there was no internet, obviously. And if we went back and read the newspapers from the old days, we'd also be fairly horrified at the amount of simple-mindedness and demagoguery that was dominant in many local and regional papers, and really weren't national papers here, but even national papers. So on the one hand, I'm sort of anti-nostalgia in this. On the second hand, I would say that I have underestimated, at first I underestimated the significance, I'd say, of the technological revolution in communications, and which has obviously affected the media in such a big way. I sort of had the kind of the old-fashioned view that it's a big deal, of course, to have the internet, and then it's a big deal to have iPhones and to have instant ability to get online and to read everything that's ever been written, and also talk to your friends simultaneously and so forth, and find out the weather. And one shouldn't underestimate. I mean, it's a big social, but I thought it was a big change, but somehow not really the same as railroads and airplanes and the kind of massive changes of the industrial age, which are so obviously, in a funny way, so far obvious a change, I guess you'd say, visible a change. But I think I was just wrong about that. I think it is a pretty fundamental change. It's affecting all kinds of things in our lives, obviously. And I think, and it's affected the media in a huge way. And social media is different from older media, and older media has been changed a lot by social media. Not all the changes are for the worse. I'm not one of those who thinks, it's just terrible that people are on Twitter. I obviously don't think that, since I am on Twitter, or that we are having, the fact that we're able to have this conversation and for whatever it's worth, and we can do it by Zoom, and it takes no time at all, or money, frankly, at all. And that's not a bad thing. I can read a lot of stuff that the degree to which, I'd say, people your age, if I can put it this way, not you, I'm sure, but don't appreciate how little access one had to information in the old days is really astonishing. If you wanted to read a foreign, find out what's going on in Belarus, so I mean, good luck. There was 1 or 2 correspondents there, maybe, and you read the New York Times. But the idea that you could go online and read a lot of European papers, and depending on your language abilities, read some stuff literally from Minsk, but if you didn't know, you can hit Google Translate and get at least a tolerable sense of what might be happening and look at video. I mean, none of that, of course, existed. And so I remain sort of bullish on the internet and bullish on social media as communications opportunities. I learned about a lot of interesting thinkers I hadn't previously known of. Young people who were assistant professors or something or other at places not even in the U.S. I see someone tweeting about some article, I link to it, and I think, well, this is pretty interesting. How would I ever have known about that 20 years ago? So I'm not, a long way of saying that I'm not some kind of, I don't think, Luddite about this. Having said all that, there obviously are problems and challenges, and I do think the instant judgment of social media, the ability in which it plays into a kind of cancel culture, and also demagoguery. So sort of demagoguery on the right and cancel culture on the left seems to be the way it's worked out, but they're not that far from each other, of course. And the compartmentalization or the echo chamber character of a lot of it, where people just read what they agree with, and the way in which Facebook's in particular algorithm fits into that, though they all do fit into it a little bit. that's a much. I now take those concerns more seriously than I did, 10 years ago.
I shall ask this in deliberately broad terms. Can you offer any reflections on your time with the Weekly Standard?
Yeah, so we started the Weekly Standard, which was a weekly magazine, obviously, in 1995. It's a kind of classic case of everything doesn't quite work the way you expect. I mean, we had a very good run. It was closed by our owners, foolishly, I think, 2 years ago. So we had a good 22, 23-year run. I edited it for the first 21 years, I guess. But we started just as the internet literally was beginning, or at least becoming publicly available, you might say. So we had all this idea that, well, very important to have a weekly magazine that was center right, intelligent, like the New Republic of its day, but on more on the right, little like The Economist, but less news and more opinion and culture and so forth. There wasn't really anything like that in the U.S. National Review was biweekly. It was located in New York. It wasn't that on top of things politically, though there was some interesting stuff there. And of course, the internet grew up, and so within 2-3 years, like everyone else, we're putting stuff online, and the whole idea of weekly, and we kept it in the name, but of course, it became a little ridiculous. Like every other weekly magazine, we ended up posting 15 pieces a day, and the line got pretty blurred between print and online, and that was all fine. And I think we adjusted adequately, and it was enjoyable. But it is one of the for me, that's one of those lessons of how little one could predict. We had a lot of intelligent people working with us, and people who were media pros, and no one quite saw what was about to happen to the world of print magazines and print newspapers, for that matter, and print journalism, or journalism more broadly. Generally, I think we've published a lot of good material. I obviously would do some things differently, I suppose, but and I hope we provided an example of how to think examples of how to think seriously about politics, international relations, cultural questions. One of the things I'm proudest of, actually, is the back of the book, the arts, the literature section, which was never a huge part of the magazine. It was usually 9 pages, I think, about a 44. So, a quarter or fifth of the magazine, sometimes a little more than 9. But I remember at the very beginning, John Podhoretz and Fred Barnes and I, David Brooks, the West, we were sitting around planning it. We really determined we don't want to just be crotchety right-wing critics of everything that's happening. And so here's another novel that's bad because we don't like any current fiction. And here's another, museum that's got a stupid exhibition. And we did some of that, obviously, as you should have to. And some of that criticism was quite strong and quite pointed, and I think quite true. But we always looked for sort of, we never quite bought into the everything was once great and now it's just gone totally downhill. And we also tried to recommend things to people, whether current or past, rediscovering writers, 100th anniversary sort of things, poets. Kristol wrote 2 wonderful pieces, I think, on Philip Larkin, for example. So I think we kind of construct to sort of let's introduce people to stuff that they might find interesting. And not all that stuff is politically congenial necessarily to us. Not all of it is perfect, and people can like or dislike Larkin or other, poets and other God knows, writers. We did a fair amount of music and art. I feel that was a real contribution. And I worry a little bit that that's getting a little harder to find, perhaps, in our current culture. Though, again, here the internet does help. If you're interested in classical music, you can learn a lot about classical music by going online. But even just on something like Twitter, just following the right people and following their links to what they recommend. And the same is true of almost every other field. But you can also, it takes a while to find that. And there is some utility in getting that, in the old days, getting it each week in a magazine that, if you for a lot of time, it gives you a kind of guide of what you might want to read and so forth. So anyway, it was all a good experience. I don't know quite what the world of magazines and newspapers is going to look like 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. It's changing pretty fast, and the economics of it are pretty daunting for an old-fashioned type of magazine. But again, I also, the degree to which people abroad read the Weekly Standard online, whereas in the old days, I remember when we started, we offered subscriptions to Britain and elsewhere. But, they came 3 weeks late and it was expensive and, it was hard to kind of, now, of course, it's all instant. So that's a kind of big opportunity really for a kind of the healthy side of globalization, a kind of genuine exchange of ideas and information that has not been so easy over the last couple of centuries.
We referenced this earlier, but I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts in greater detail. Regarding the conservative media space specifically, have principled outlets been sufficiently rigorous in assessing President Trump since his election, or have they become far too generous in your perspective?
No, much too generous and much too much party organs and much too apologetic for things they shouldn't apologize for. A healthy conservatism really depends on healthy liberalism, on you can't expect politicians to necessarily be wildly courageous and step up and criticize everything the leader of their own party does. You should expect journals that are sympathetic to the goals and overall worldview of that party to step up and criticize. Otherwise, who is going to? And I think there's a long, long tradition of that in here and abroad. And the failure to do that, in the sense that, no, I don't want to give comfort to the other side, and I'm on this, the tribalism, the party loyalty is bad. I mean, you expect it maybe for the 2 months before an election, fine, but it really has been crippling, I think. And I run into a lot of young people who are kind of astounded by it themselves, but who also don't quite know. I mean, is it right that, is this the way the world works, that you have to choose between Trump and the most left-wing parts of the Democratic Party, and you don't get to sort of say, wait a second, I really don't want either of those things. I'm encouraged that I run into a large number of people who don't want either of those things, but I do think the conservative media, although you could make the same criticism of the liberal media, incidentally, at times too, but the conservative media in particular, which in olden days, in my father's day and Bill Buckley's day, and was very proud of being independent-minded and sort of ornery and not publishing. The National Review was critical of Reagan a lot, actually, and from different points of view. Sometimes he wasn't conservative enough. Sometimes he was being too dogmatic and applying some conservative doctrines and so forth. And that was healthy. And the degree to which you don't see that today is not healthy.
If I may ask one very quick, easy question to conclude with.
Sure.
What are some of your favorite books, and what books have had the greatest influence on your worldview or philosophical, political outlook?
So, I came to Harvard and studied with Harvey Mansfield, who was a student of Leo Strauss. And so the whole Straussian world was very important for me, and Strauss himself is a hugely important thinker, I think, in terms of how to read text, but also of the substance of sort of of the critique of too dogmatic attachment to modernity and being open-minded about what one could learn from the classics. I'd say I was never, I read and taught a little bit of course, Plato and Aristotle and all that. But I myself, my own work was more on the Federalist Papers and Tocqueville, which I highly recommend. Burke had a big impact on me as a kind of conservative, but also a liberal conservative. It's kind of important to remember that Burke was a Whig, not a Tory, and they didn't quite, I'm not sure Tories quite existed. I guess they kind of existed by Burke's time, right? He certainly was a Whig, and was a reformer and was, in all kinds of ways. So I've always been attracted to that. As I was saying earlier, I'm also, in a way, I was reading some Thomas Paine, and I must admit that was where once I would have just dismissed Paine's critique of Burke or taken unreservedly Burke's side in that debate. I now see a little bit of more merit in some of Paine and some of that soaring rhetoric about the rights of man and the criticism of Burke's excessive, perhaps, willingness to, I don't think Burke really was a traditionalist exactly, but he thought it very important to prop up and support these traditions. Maybe that was not quite always the right thing to do. Anyway, I think Straussian analysis, the great works of political philosophy, but also recently, again, in light of the authoritarian populist temptation, I was rereading some of Orwell. It was really wonderful and unpredictable, and great essayists who really look at the situation in a non-dogmatic way and try to think through what's happening. they're really worth a lot, I think. And that's a tradition that the Anglo-American world has a great deal of examples, many examples of. So I recommend all kinds of thinkers like that. And then, as I said earlier, in a way, I think sort of important to read. People have their own tastes and their own preferences in literature and music and art, but important to read some of that. You know what I mean? It's I think if one just reads politics, one gets awfully narrow. And so, but I won't tell people what great literature to read, and I haven't read that much. So, but one can learn a lot from that, especially if you read them with the eye towards learning something and not just viewing them as kind of interesting period pieces from the past. They all turn out to be the great authors, novelists, dramatists turn out to be so much more interesting thinkers than one realizes at first, when they're presented to you in a slightly cartoonish way sometimes, So, so don't confine yourself to contemporary stuff. That would be my main advice, actually. Read the older authors with an open mind. And, people have different tastes. I used to be more dogmatic about this and this thinker is really great and this thinker is kind of second tier. But you can learn a lot from high-level second-tier thinkers. Most of us aren't even at the second tier. And different people have different tastes and just learn in different ways, it turns out. Not everyone is going to read Plato and Hegel and so forth. So I'm sort of open-minded about what people should read exactly. But I do think liberating yourself from the present, from presentism, from the idea that everything important that's been thought and said is being said right now, and that you can't learn an awful lot from the arguments and debates of the past, whether in political philosophy or in politics or in literature. That, I think, is for me, that was one of the greatest contributions of sort of Strauss and Straussianism, that it really was kind of a liberation from that presentism that I think really narrows one's perspective so much. So I encourage people to read great books and good books and interesting books from the past, and they can decide themselves what most moves them and what really speaks to them.
Thank you, Mr. Kristol. This has been a true pleasure.
Well, I really enjoyed it myself, and good luck with all your enterprises over there.
Join us again next week for another Bournebrook podcast.